The engineer's name was Barrett Hansen. He was 24 years old and he had left his jacket. This was the entirety of the reason he came back, not instinct, not presentiment, not the particular sensitivity of someone attuned to important moments. He had driven halfway to the freeway on-ramp and realized his jacket was on the chair in the corner of the control room, and the October night was cold, and he turned around. He parked in the same spot he had vacated 20 minutes earlier. The Sunset Sound parking lot was empty at this hour. The sessions ran late, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning, but tonight had ended earlier than usual. Everyone released with a kind of collective understanding that the work of the day was done and the final session tomorrow was close enough that rest was the right preparation. The musicians had left. Paul Rothchild had left. The other engineers had left. Hansen had been the last one out, he thought, which made the jacket on the chair a specifically embarrassing oversight, but also the only reason for what was about to happen. He let himself back into Sunset Sound with the key he still had because the sessions were not yet technically finished. There was one more day scheduled, one final session tomorrow that would close out what had been, by any measure, an extraordinary few months of recording. He walked down the corridor toward Studio 2 and put his hand on the door and opened it, and heard her. She was in the recording booth, not at the microphone stand, not set up for a take, just standing in the middle of the room with no headphones, no setup, no indication that what was happening was anything other than a woman alone in a room singing to herself. The sound coming through the glass was a cappella, no band, no instruments, no track playing in her earphones because there were no earphones, because she was not recording, because no one had been asked to record anything, and no tape was rolling, and the control room, which Hansen was now standing in, was dark except for the ambient glow of equipment on standby. She was singing Mercedes Benz. He knew the song. He had been in the room for the recording 3 days earlier, a single take, the spontaneous a cappella performance that producer Paul Rothchild had immediately understood was complete, was final, was exactly what it needed to be and nothing more and nothing less. The tape from that session was already in the can. The song was done. She was singing it again alone in an empty studio the night before the last session. Not for the tapes, not for the record, not for anyone. Hansen stood very still in the dark control room. He did not reach for the recording console. He did not press any button that would have turned the dark equipment into active equipment, that would have captured what was happening in the booth in the archival way that the previous take had been captured. He stood with his jacket in his hand. He had seen it immediately, on the chair in the corner, and had crossed to it in the moment before he heard her, and he did not move. The song came through the glass. "Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz?" The voice was different from the recorded version, not worse, different. The recorded version had a particular quality that Rothchild had recognized immediately as unrepeatable. The freshness of a first take, the spontaneity of a performance that had not been planned or prepared, the specific aliveness of something happening for the first time. That version was extraordinary, and it was in the can, and it would be on the record. This version was something else, quieter, more interior. The voice at a volume calibrated for a room with no audience rather than a room with microphones and a producer, and the implicit audience of everyone who would eventually hear the recording. She was not projecting. She was simply singing the way people sing when they are alone, when the singing is for the singer rather than for anyone else, when the voice is a private instrument being used for a private purpose. Hansen stood in the dark and listened. My friends all drive Porsches, I must make amends. He thought about the session from 3 days earlier. He had been at the board and Rothchild had been beside him, and they had both been watching through the glass when she had turned to them from wherever she had been standing and said, "I have this thing, can we try it?" And Rothchild had said yes, and she had sung it straight through without stopping, and when she finished there had been a silence in the control room of the specific quality that he had learned in the months of the Pearl sessions to recognize as the silence of something that had arrived completely. Rothchild had said, "That's it, one take." She had laughed, slightly surprised, slightly pleased, the way you are slightly surprised and pleased when the thing you were not certain about turns out to have been exactly right. And now she was here alone, the night before the last session, singing it again in an empty studio with no one listening, or almost no one. Hansen had been the assistant engineer on the Pearl sessions for 4 months. He had come to the sessions with the particular combination of technical competence and artistic enthusiasm that made a good assistant engineer, someone who understood the equipment well enough to manage it efficiently, and who cared enough about the music being made to want it to be good. He had worked sessions before, had been in rooms with recording artists before, had understood from those rooms that the work of making records involved long stretches of ordinary technical labor punctuated by moments of something else entirely. But the Pearl sessions had been different in a way that he had not entirely anticipated and had not entirely been able to articulate to people who were not in the room. The difference was Janis. Not the voice, though the voice was extraordinary and he had understood this from the first day. The voice was a given. It was why they were all there, why the sessions had been convened, why Paul Rothchild had cleared his schedule for months. The voice was the known quantity. What he had not anticipated was the quality of her presence in the room when she was working. The way she engaged with the music, not as a performer executing a plan, but as someone genuinely discovering in real time what the song required. She would arrive at the studio with the song already prepared in the technical sense. She knew the words, the melody, the arrangement, and then she would begin working. And the working was not the execution of a plan, but the progressive revelation of what the song actually was. She would go through takes not in search of the perfect performance of a fixed target, but in search of the target itself, finding it by accumulation, by the gradual stripping away of everything that was not essential until what remained was the thing. The willingness to try things that might not work, and the honesty about when they hadn't worked, and the equal honesty about when they had. The particular combination of craft and openness that produced the recordings they were producing, which felt, to everyone in the room, in the way that the best recordings make themselves felt, like they were capturing something true. He had watched her work through the Pearl material for 4 months and had understood, in the way you understand things you have been in the presence of rather than things you have been told, that he was in the presence of something he would not be in the presence of again. He did not think about this often or explicitly, but he thought about it sometimes in the late nights when the session had finished and the equipment was being packed down and the studio was returning to its neutral state, and the recording that had been made that evening was on tape and would be there tomorrow and the day after and indefinitely. He thought about it now, standing in the dark with his jacket, listening through the glass. Worked hard all my lifetime, no help from my friends. The voice was easy in a way that live performances never were, not because it was casual, but because it was unguarded. The performance of a voice unguarded by an audience is a different thing from the performance of a voice with an audience, even a small one, even a sympathetic one. The audience changes what the voice does, even when the change is subtle, even when the performer is experienced enough to manage the audience's effect. Some small portion of the voice is always speaking to the room rather than from the interior, always calibrating itself against the exterior, always aware of reception. In an empty room, that calibration disappears. What remains is the voice speaking to nothing external, to the air, to the bare walls and the acoustic foam and the empty microphone stand, speaking in the deepest sense to itself. And in that speaking to itself, the voice reveals things that the speaking to an audience, however intimate, does not reveal. Hansen heard things in that version that he had not heard in the recorded version. Not better things, the recorded version was the recorded version and was already done and was right. Different things. The things that the voice did when it was not performing, when it was not even aware of itself as a voice, when it was simply the sound a person made when the feeling required a sound, and the sound was the most direct available translation. There was a roughness to it, not the roughness of the powerful live performances he had heard recordings of, not the deliberate and controlled roughness of craft deployed at maximum capacity, but something smaller and more private. The roughness of an interior voice, the roughness of the voice you use when no one is asking anything of it and it is simply being what it is. He had spent 4 months listening to her voice through glass and headphones and speakers, in the professional context of a recording session where the voice was the subject of careful and loving attention. He had heard it at close range and understood its qualities and capabilities and the specific things it could do that other voices could not. He had not heard it like this before. He stood very still. So, Lord, won't you buy me a color TV? He did not reach for the console. He had made that decision not as a decision exactly, but as the absence of a decision which sometimes functions as a decision. The tape was not rolling. He was not going to make it roll. What was happening in the booth was not a session. It was not a take. It was not material for the record, which was almost finished, which was as good as it was going to be, which was already extraordinary. What was happening in the booth was private. He understood this the way you understand things that don't need to be explained, immediately, completely, without reasoning. The song ended. Dialing for dollars is trying to find me. The last note hung in the air of the booth for a moment, not the performed sustain of a final note held for effect, but the natural duration of a sound in a room, the note lasting as long as the room held it, and then releasing. Silence. Janis stood in the middle of the recording booth. She was not looking toward the control room glass. Her head was slightly down, her hands at her sides, the posture of someone in the moment after a song, in the specific interior space between the singing and the returning to ordinary time. Hansen did not move. He was very aware in that moment of the glass between them, the glass that separated the control room from the recording booth, that was there to prevent sound bleed, that was also, at that moment, the membrane between the witnessed and the unwitnessed, between his being in the room and his not being in the room. He had his jacket. He had what he came back for. He backed away from the glass slowly, in the way of someone who understands that the backing away is itself an act, not of cowardice, but of respect. Of understanding that what he had heard was not his to announce or to comment on or to turn into something it had not been intended to be. He let himself out of the control room. He walked back down the corridor. He let himself out of the building. He sat in his car for a moment before starting the engine. The October night was cold and clear. The Los Angeles sky had the particular quality it had on cold, clear nights, more stars than on warm nights, the air sharp enough to give the light edges. He put on his jacket. He thought about what he had heard. He thought about the voice at that volume in that room unguarded. He thought about the recorded version, the take from 3 days earlier, the one that was in the can, the one that was going to be on the record, and about the version he had just heard, which was not in any can, which was not going to be on any record, which existed now only in his memory and in the air of the studio, which was already returning to neutral. He thought about the decision he had not made, the decision to not reach for the console, to not roll the tape. He had not thought about it as a decision at the time. He had simply not done it, the way you simply do not do certain things because the not doing is immediately apparent as correct. But sitting in the car now, in the cold Los Angeles night, he thought about what it would have meant to have done it, to have rolled the tape and captured the version he had heard and added it to the archive of the Pearl sessions. He thought, no, that would have been wrong. That would have been a different kind of wrong from any technical or professional wrong, not against policy, not against procedure, against something that did not have an official name, but that was real. The unrecorded version was unrecorded because it was supposed to be unrecorded, because some things are for the room and the air and the person singing and not for the tape, because the tape captures everything it captures and it cannot distinguish between what was meant to be captured and what was not, and the distinction matters, and he had been the one in the room who understood the distinction and had honored it. He thought about the last session tomorrow. The final takes, the final decisions, the closing of the Pearl album that had been, for 4 months, the organizing principle of his professional life. He started the engine. He drove home through the cold Los Angeles night. He did not tell anyone what he had heard, not Rothchild, not the other engineers, not the musicians. He carried it the way you carry certain things, not as a secret exactly, because a secret implies something that should not be known, and what he had heard was not in that category. It was simply private. It belonged to the empty studio and the unguarded voice in the October night. He had gone back for his jacket. He had heard something he was not supposed to hear. He had chosen not to interfere with it and had left. That was the whole of it. Except that it was not the whole of it, because what he had heard stayed with him, through the final session the next day, through the completion of Pearl, through the months that followed and the decades that followed, through the long retrospective consideration of what those 4 months at Sunset Sound had been and what they had produced and what it had meant to be in the room for them. 2 versions of the same song, separated by 3 days in the presence of an audience of one who had not been invited and who understood when he heard it that the right thing was to put on his jacket and go home. The October night held both. The record held one of them. The other one was his to carry, and he carried it. The Pearl album was released in January 1971, 3 months after Janis Joplin died in a Los Angeles hotel room on October 4, 1970, 4 days after Barrett Hansen had stood in the dark control room of Sunset Sound and heard her sing Mercedes Benz alone. The record that came out in January was finished without her, the final overdubs completed by the band and Rothchild, the sequence assembled, the packaging designed, but the recording was hers. The voice on it was hers, the takes that she had approved and the takes that she had not approved, and the spontaneous a cappella performance she had given in a single take 3 days before Hansen came back for his jacket. All of it was hers, and all of it was permanent, and all of it went out into the world. Mercedes Benz on the record is 51 seconds long. It is the last track on the album. It ends with her laughing, a small, private laugh, the laugh of someone who has just done something they were pleased by, the laugh that Rothschild had captured because it was there and because it was true and because the truth of it was exactly right. The song ends with the laugh, the album ends with the laugh, and then there is silence. Hansen heard the album when it came out. He heard the track, he heard the laugh at the end. He thought about the night he had come back for his jacket, and the version he had heard through the glass, and the decision he had not made to reach. For the console, the record gave the world the recorded version, clean, final, permanent, exactly as she had intended it. And the other version, the one in the empty studio, the one at the private volume, the one that existed only in the air of the room and in the memory of a 24-year-old engineer who had gone back for his jacket, that version gave him something different, something that the record, as perfect as it was, could not contain. It gave him the voice when there was no one listening, which was, in its own way, the truest version of all.